Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for U Sports Football. Me and Tom are back on the mics, giving you the newest installment of the Exit Meeting series, where today we are taking our talents all the way to the end of the 401. Under the shadow of the Golden Arches, a little town known as Wind City with the blue collar and gold swagger under the tutelage of the Don, Coach JP Cercelli. We're talking a little Windsor Lancer football. We're going to get into all of that and a bag of chips. But first, Tom, how the heck you doing, my friend?
Oh, I'm always doing great whenever we get to talk some blue collar, gold swagger, Windsor football, man. This is an outstanding team to be able to talk about. And the Don, Coach Cercelli, one of the biggest, I think, aura farmers that there is out there with the way that his game day setup is. So it's really just outstanding. And I'm so excited to talk a little Windsor football.
Great usage of the term aura, to each their own, potato, patata. And frankly, as we'll get into it, looking at the rosters, and we're still at a stage now where we don't really have too many insights in terms of who's returning, who's not. We have a sense based on seniority, things of that nature, and guys who are eligible for the draft or who were at the draft last year. But as we were kind of doing a little prep beforehand, just to kind of give a little peek around the curtain, my final thoughts as I was going through all my notes here, I was like, oh, shoot, I might actually think that when we did our schedule release episode, we might have had them a tick higher with the drop this team could take. But you mentioned Coach Cercelli and the staff that he has there, and that just special aspect of how well they bring in these American players and make it work. And that to me is so essential that they make it work. It's not just bringing in guns for hire. These people, these players become part of this program. And then you add in, of course, what, Joe Cercelli, Patrick Donovan, Randy Beardy, like such a great coaching staff. This is a team where it's the staff I have as much faith in as any other. Let's get it started as we do, looking at the year in review, 2024. When we look at this year for them, Tom, 2024, it's a team that finished 5-3 in a lot of tight ball games. Still not able to kind of get over that hump. And, we always end up talking about it. You run into, Western eventually, you run into your Lauriers, a team in Windsor that's had some really tight first round battles. What are your kind of overall impressions when you reflect on the 2024 Windsor Lancers?
Well, we have to start looking at, a kind of an elephant in the room sort of deal. And I think we stumbled upon this, and I don't want to get a little too far ahead here because I'm certainly we'll start breaking this down. But now, after thinking about this, I'm starting to wonder that Windsor window, if you will. I think that's closing real quick here. I mean, we've seen some outstanding players. We've seen a resurgence of Windsor football, which is really fantastic to see. But for the past 2 years now, it's been the same story of outstanding defense, great run game, but no passing game to lean on. And a lot of it comes down to the quarterback position. I mean, a couple of years ago, we saw Danny Skelton and do his thing. And at least for half the season, he looked like the guy and then fell off at certain areas here. And then Nick Domovsky comes in and he looks like the dude. And then he gets injured and go back and forth. And there's a lot of things that can happen. And obviously, you can't really control injuries in certain areas. But you start looking at some of these guys, and I know that you've got the numbers, and we'll talk about this at least eventually here, but there's a number of fourth and fifth year guys who are key components. And you're thinking, unless you have another outstanding recruiting class or two, is this the Windsor window closing?
No, honestly, it's a great point you bring up. And you're right. It's the elephant in the room. And I think we need to rip the Band-Aid off right away and have this conversation. And we said it, I forget which other exit meeting it was, or it might have been on one of the non-exit meeting episodes we've put out in these last few months. And you were mentioning like wanting to see Danny Skelton and have a good year. And I responded being like, I want to see Nick Domovsky week one and just ride or die with that guy. Because not that everything comes down to numbers, but it wasn't too long ago. In fact, it was the 2023 season that we're partway through the year and having a conversation about where does Danny Skelton fit in the top five of QBs in the OUA.
Mhm.
I know it's not all about stats, and we know that Danny Skelton's also battled some injury, right? We got to see a bit of a quarterback roulette, partly due to the injury, partly due to just the way that Coach Cercelli and his staff and offensive coordinator and Coach Cercelli, really has sometimes a short leash on these guys.
Mhm.
But I'm just going to read some quarterback names, and I want you to stop me when I get to the point where you'd put Danny Skelton in there. So Taylor Elgersma, Evan Hillock, Keegan Hall, Elijah Barnes, Tristan Aboud, Alex Vreeken, Josh Jansen, Sean Law, Caleb O'Donohue, Nick Orr, like
Maybe.
in the Nick Caban duo in Waterloo. We saw some good football out of Anthony Leo last year.
Mm-hmm.
We made a joke a couple weeks ago that there's 11 OUA football teams. There's more than 11 good quarterbacks in this league. And don't get me wrong, Danny Skelton is a good quarterback, but you're totally right. And what makes things worse, and man, we're just right into it, I guess. Like, because you talked about what a great defense that's been, and it shouldn't be taken away from the fact that partly why that defense is great is because Coach Patrick Donovan's at the helm and he's
Mm-hmm.
leading that team. The same way that when we talk about the run game, what Coach Beardy's been doing there for 10 years, it's been incredible. But defensively, and I don't know, do we just go through the numbers some of the names right now? Just to, since we're here and we're kind of going high, and maybe we'll start low and maybe we'll end high as a result of it. Look at a guy like Devin Veresuk. He's draft eligible. By all accounts, had a nice performance. Liam Hoskins was at the Invitational, got the call up to the National. Claudia Mooson, one of the best D linemen of the last 3 years in all of U Sports. He's draft eligible. And those are just guys going to the draft. You add in other seniors on that defense, including Breton McDougall, Istvan Asibo Dotsie, Ethan John, and my guy, Bobby Springer.
Mm-hmm.
Those are major hits to your linebacking core, your DBs, and losing one of the best pass rushers. On top of the fact, the year prior, they lose our guy move the heck out of the way of Gelly, and
Mm-hmm.
they managed to hold make it through okay. Then you add on the fact that there's a team that lost George Una on the O-line 2 years ago to the CFL. They're probably losing Owen Mueller. So Jackson Morgan, the last of that huge just trio of dudes they had in there, I'm sure they'll fill those gaps effectively. And then they could lose Joey Zorn. They could lose Christopher John. Like, we look at all the things. So we start off by identifying the elephant in the room with the fact that the passing attack's been less than stellar. And in part, that's probably because they can lean on that run game and just win games that way. But and know that that defense is going to be there for them. But those other sure things might not be sure things going into next year, depending on how the pieces fall with some of these seniors and draft eligible guys.
Yeah. I mean, we already saw a bit of a look at this. And once again, stats do not tell the whole story, like you mentioned previously, but they do tell some of the story. And even when you compare 2023 to 2024 with this defense here, in 2023, this Windsor defense, unbelievable. Number 2 in the entire ODUA in points per game at 16.5. This year, number 3 at 22.9. Last year, they gave up 290 yards per game. This year, 339. And while those aren't real big jumps, and passing yards and rushing yards are the same kind of deal here, it is showing you did notice a bit of a gap. There is a little bit of a change that happened here, albeit, yeah, you only went from number 2 to number 3. But I don't know, especially if all of those names that you just mentioned are gone for next year. I think that could continuously go down. Now, you've got some outstanding players in the wings, like a Jason Rashotzi,
Hmm.
like all of these other dudes who are there. And I'm not saying that Windsor is going to fall off by any means here, but like this championship level window that we saw and that we were thinking, hey, you were right there with Laurier in 23 and you almost beat them and they almost beat Western. And so you're right in there. And then in 24, you don't make it out of the first round of the playoffs despite hosting a playoff game. And I know the Windsor faithful are faithful to their team and they love this resurgence and they might try to crucify us for this. But I'm telling you guys, this could be the window shutting here, and you have to capitalize on whatever you have left this year.
Most definitely. And I love that you brought up Jason Rashotzi because, again, we can go through some of the young guys on this team of where there's all the reason to be optimistic in the world, and we'll get there, right? It just, like, off the jump, that was really apparent. And you mentioned those close games, and it starts off in terms of just going through their season. They lose that home game to Queens in the playoffs, and that's where they started the year off. And
Hmm.
that's a game where they narrowly sneak by Queens, where Bobby Springer gets, was it 2, 3 interceptions?
Hmm.
Vreeken throws 4 interceptions in total on the game, and they beat Queens at home by 4 points. And we were talking about it on the Queens pod of like those teams were so neck and neck that if that game is flipped. Queens takes that week 1 game. I know Queens won the playoff game on a last second touchdown in Windsor anyways, but if Queens ends up winning week 1, if Rican like throws one fewer interceptions, they win that game. They're hosting that first round matchup, and it's probably not even like nearly as close as it was. Again, Windsor is a tough place to win in. The travel, the weird stuff, being on the border, it just we. I feel like we just have enough evidence that like this weird, just kind of what juju, voodoo, whatever ness is going on there is kind of being validated. But then they sneak out of Carleton with a win. Brady Litster kicking it from at the 55. Gosh, love you, Brady Litster. Also from St. Thomas, another
Oh,
feather in
yeah.
the cap there. A Carlton team that we realized more and more as the season went on is actually quite good in terms of the talent. We don't need to talk about Carlton anymore. They take care of business against York. They take care of business against Ottawa. That crazy ending to the game. Liam Talbot coming through clutch at the end of it. Again, the ending got cut short. And Ottawa, again, if we actually had the film of it, I'm sure they weren't happy. There was a lot of consternation, frustration how that game ended. Ottawa might have won it on the, to quote, the longest yard on some schoolyard bullshit. Take care of business against Toronto. That Guelph game, which my goodness, maybe we'll do a bit of a deep dive into that one. 45-40 for Guelph. What a beautiful game of football that was. They lose to Laurier 33-26. They lose to Western 46-5, and that's a hell of a way to end your season. On the road for two of those at Guelph and at Western. You're competitive against Guelph and Laurier to say the least. And again, as you should be in the neighborhood of those teams, but seeing these close games early on, and again, that piece on just, you know, figuring out the quarterback. And we talked about this so much when in the dark ages of Guelph football, when they were playing a little quarterback roulette. And this is when, again, if you don't trust 2 linemen talking quarterback play, when we had one of the most highest proficient quarterbacks in this century of OUA football, and Nate Hobbs on the pod consistently, he was on the same page as us, echoing the sentiment of, you know what? Don't love it when you're rotating in quarterbacks that much. Having a rhythm, being able to have that trust, have that confidence, pretty important for a position where you're getting your head nearly taken off every play and you need to read complex defenses and all these things.
Mhm.
So a lot going on there. Tom, do we want to take a look at this is our first pod with this, doing the 2020 with the 2025 schedule up. Do we want to jump into that, or do we want to take a look at some of these players going to the combine?
Oh, I think we got to look at some of these players going to the combine first and foremost here. I want to deep dive a little bit more into this past season, just a
Oh,
wee bit
please.
here before we jump into that. But you summed it up all of this beautifully and a lot of the points that I had originally made here. But to your credit, I mean, there has to be. I know you've got the Dawn. I know you've got an outstanding coaching staff in Windsor here, but it's going to affect your mental game when you go 5-0 and then lose your last 3 of the season against the top tier of the OUA in Guelph Laurier, and then to end off the regular season 46-5 in London. That's a tough way to end that, and that's a tough way to get into that. And I'm sure the messaging there, okay, we still did well enough to host a playoff game. We still did this and still did that, whatever. But I know that that's got to be affecting the psyche in there for those guys and going into that. So it's a hell of a thing to come through, and it's a tough deal for sure. And I mean, you come out with an outstanding game, like you mentioned, against Queens to start things off, and maybe that turns into something of an Achilles heel where you go, you know what, we just ended a 3-game losing streak, but we are hosting Queens again. We did this previously. We can beat these guys. We have this confidence, and it's not overconfidence, but maybe it's a little bit something extra that it shouldn't have been. And then Queens comes in and they steal one, and they go to the semifinals of the Yates Cup here. And so there's a lot of things going into this Windsor team that I'm really interested in and I'm looking at. I mean, it's the same story like we mentioned. This is a squad that can run the ball and that's got great defense and is almost built similar to a Western Mustangs in the idea that if you can score, my goodness, are you well built to hold the damn ball? The only difference here is that Windsor is not a team that typically can score and score often. That's the whole recipe around the Western Mustangs. They score and then they hold the ball, drive the ball 80 yards down the field for another score and eat up 6 minutes of clock. I have no doubt that Windsor could do the same thing. And in fact, I think they did that in a few games here where they held the ball and they were really able to control the clock here, but they're not finishing in the end zone consistently enough. And I think that's what is keeping them back from ultimately where they want to go in this one. But yeah, like you said, do we want to just deep dive into that Guelph game just a little bit before we go into that?
Might as well. And I was quickly reminded in going through the little recap of it. This was that game where, hey, look, we love what's going on there in Guelph. We love what Coach Soria is doing, changing the culture. But this maybe he got a little bit cocky in this one because this is where they tried to go for that sneak attack onside kick after the Donovan Malloy touchdown to put him up 10-0, which Shane Johnson returns to the crib pretty much untouched for 61 yards. Certainly that changes the tide, swings the momentum huge, but also a game where as we alluded to earlier, not uncommon where we're seeing, well, let's go to Windsor's first major, offensive major. It's our guy, Nick Domofsky, hooking up with Mateo Triffett. That's great. Again, Domofsky, for all the talent that he's shown just from the jump, OSFL All-Star for the Essex Ravens, just a star at the U18 level. Local kid, you love the story. We hope it works out. Has battled some injury. Had that great game in the quarterfinal game against Carleton in 2023, nearly picking up that or picking up that win for them. But it's the point I'll make on there, I'll pass to you, is we had Domofsky to Triffin in the second quarter, and the last score for Windsor is Corson Roy rushing it in, and then unfortunately not hooking up with his receiver to get the 2-point convert, which could have made it about a field goal. And I'm very much recollecting the just consternation and pain of watching how tight this game was at the end. But again, point being, starting with one guy, ending with the other. And I really don't want to judge I guess we judge all the time what coordinators and coaches do. I don't want to be terribly too much of a critique on that because I don't know the rationale, and these folks have forgotten more about football than I'll know. But that's just, again, one of the things that just jumps out. So you get that lucky bounce, quite literally, on Guelph trying to do his onside kick for seemingly, their reasons, to keep it close early, and it remains close throughout the game. And then again, the quarterback switch, which I do not abide. The dude does not abide.
No, and on paper, I don't agree with that either. However, correct me if I'm wrong. Is this not the game where Nick Domofsky goes down with an injury?
I don't know. You might be right. That's the unfortunate thing of his young career, is that he has been very injured. You may be right, but I'll just say, whether that's why it happened in this case, like, we can go through other receipts, other box scores of them just doing it for non-injury reasons. But point taken.
No, but I completely agree with you here, and it's one of those. It goes back to a coaching philosophy, I guess, if you really want to talk about it, and the idea of, hey, if you've got a quarterback who's playing at a certain point and they're not playing to where you're hoping for, do you risk taking them out to put another guy in and potentially disrupt that chemistry, or do you just let this quarterback go through the entire game, potentially waste one, and then move on and say, okay, next week we're going to go with somebody else in this? It's not an easy answer. It's not an easy question to answer here, but I don't ever believe in the idea of, like, even something that we saw with the Guelph Griffins a few years ago, where it's seemingly every other drive was a new quarterback going in. And we saw obviously the lack of success that kind of brought. So I'm always in agreement with our good friend Nate Hobbs when he mentioned it's good as best you can to just have that one quarterback in there to try to get you as much rhythm as you can. But even with that, I mean, you start looking at some of the other aspects of this, and Nick Domofsky, while he was in there, 12 for 15, 140 yards and 1 touchdown through the air, and then another one on the ground as well. I mean, it's not a bad day for the kid, including 43 rushing yards as well. I mean, Joey Zorn, Christopher John, 8 attempts for Zorn, 7 attempts for John, and you're combined here for less than 100 yards between those two outstanding running backs. So really showcases that Guelph came into this game thinking we're going to shut down the run offensively and then we're going to be just fine. And albeit there was a special team snafu in there that helped to give them an extra touchdown, but certainly this Windsor squad, I don't think they really shied away, certainly in the beginning with Nick Demoski in there, which is why you and I are both so high on. I think Demovsky in that quarterback room, from what we've seen, is the guy right now, and he's got to be able to stay healthy if they really want a shot.
No, I'm in total agreement, and just like the age piece of it all and the hometown hero component of it all. And yeah, and I just to put a cap on that discussion, like I'm a firm believer in mojo. Like whatever you want to call it, like getting that rhythm, and again to sort of like to make things fair, because again, I don't want to be just casting dispersions towards Danny Skelton by any means. Like this is a guy who 2 years ago throws 1,800 yards and 13 touchdowns.
Mm-hmm.
Like as clearly the dude. I don't know who was backing him then. That would have been before Demovsky got there. I don't know if Roy was there, but you give him, he gets 227 attempts. That's including the two playoff games against Carleton and Western that year. I think it was Western they played in the semis. But just point being, like, when this guy has just been that dude, like, we have data to support that he's been really strong, and like they had good running attacks then as well. They like receiving cores that are like serviceable, not the best in the league, but really strong. Maybe the O-line was a bit better then, but because they still had George Una, but clearly their O-line was still good enough to run the ball really effectively this year as he went through some of those numbers. Though, of course, we haven't mentioned Wavy Mambo. It was really upsetting going back to these numbers and just remembering, like, man, the dude ended up missing so much football this year. And I just hoping whatever it was that ended up keeping him out, obviously it was serious, is going to not have missed any football this year coming up. So again, it's tough because like those numbers, that was the year where we're talking, man, Danny Skelton's in that. We were looking, who's that third quarterback? Who's that third guy? Top five after 1 and 2, it was pretty amorphous. Like Keegan Hall and Danny Skelton, I think, was a fair debate. They're putting up numbers. Keegan's probably a tick higher, but Windsor looks like the better team. I think that was a fair debate in 2023, just in terms of taking all those things into consideration. And I don't know, it all kind of, I don't know. They got to figure that piece out.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never forget in that 2023 season, the home opener is Windsor at Mac, which you and I are in attendance for. And we see this kid, Danny Skelton. I think he finished with like 3 total touchdowns on the day, including a couple of bombs. And we're going, what? What the hell is this? Who is this? Who is Windsor? And then they obviously really came into a huge resurgence into 2023 where all eyes were on them. And that's why we've been so high on them since. But yeah, it was not an unrealistic thing to say that, like, would you rather be in a Danny Skelton or Keegan Hall type where you're a better quarterback on a lesser team versus a decent quarterback on a better team? And you're starting all of this stuff. And we had, I think, at one point, Danny Skelton in our top 5, maybe at that number 4 spot behind the big 3. So a lot of things can happen, obviously, in a short period of time. We obviously saw a bit of a decline as he was going up against some of those senior and elite defenses in the Queens of the world and the Westerns of the world. But certainly they have to sort out that quarterback piece, because when you look at the other guys that you have here, I mean, with a dude like a Liam Talbot, who can be such an everything kind of back with great speed and hands, and then the rest of that receiving core that we've seen that has underperformed because I don't believe they've been getting necessarily the best quality balls at all points in terms of, placement and where things are, but they've still showcased some athleticism and some real power there. I'm just hoping that they can get a little bit more consistent at quarterback, because I think that's the biggest thing holding them back right now.
Yeah, and going back to that Mac Windsor game, like we've probably referenced this, I'm literally screaming by the second quarter, like, why did I not pick Windsor? Because this team was that was a fun year for them, and just really their coming out party. You talk about that receiving core, and maybe I'll just mention this, then we can transition to some of the guys that were in the combine, talk about those results and maybe what you've heard about some of these guys, and then transition into next year. It's a receiving core that touts seniors, thinking about last year, in Javoni Cunningham and Jalen Miller. Javoni, who's Obviously, the more notable of the two as a OUA All Star for his returning prowess, which is like second, like he's one or two, and like there's really no other debate as far as the production he's done in his career. As far as some other notable guys, you mentioned Liam Talbot's name and that kind of everything guy. I'm really excited to see if young Brendan Talbot, his younger
Mhm.
brother, who's the one of the two twins with Zach being the DB. Hey, look, we clearly see the success that big brother Liam has had. There's no reason to think that, Brendan on the offensive side and Zach, respectively, on the DB side, can't step up as well. But then guys like Colby Ginn, Shane Johnson entering that senior year, if they're back for, assuming that they're not gone for any other reason that we're not privy to. And that running back core, it's been. And so to look at the other weapons, like we've brought up Christopher John's name, we've talked about Wavy Mambo. It's time, and I think this is the transition point to talk about the draft, because this involves one of their running backs who is your Tom. Let me put a tough question to you. Given his Flint, Michigan roots, aka American born, have you disowned Joey Zorn of late, or are you still claiming him as your own?
I am. He made the right choice to become to a Canadian school, so that's what I'll judge him as. He's still our guy, my guy, in Mr. Joey Zorn.
You know what? Great answer. Maybe we shouldn't nationalize Americans anymore for play, or maybe more emphasis. Let's bring them over, play our game, and then play in our CFL. Joey Zorn, and we'll talk about the CFL draft, but we ran through the numbers with Skelton over the years, and last year was such an anomaly where he doesn't end up getting across for a touchdown, and the year prior he gets across for one touchdown. And this is frankly, I love this guy that much more as a result of seeing that than for any other reason, because he ends up averaging 8.3 yards per touch last year, 6.1 the year prior. The 2022 year, first year north of the border, breakout season, goes for 856, 7 touchdowns.
Mhm.
Just putting on a clinic. But that piece on kind of loving his game more for not having those touchdowns is because, I've had the pleasure of getting to meet him briefly after a game he had. I think it was in Waterloo once. By all accounts, it seems like a great young man. And we know how, like, you think about Christopher John, Wavy Mambo, and Liam Talbot. To me, that just speaks to his ability to say, okay, like you could picture, and maybe I'm letting a little bias slip in. You could picture an American coming into a Canadian program being like, I'm the biggest, fastest, baddest, like my numbers, this, that, and the third. Get me those touchdowns, get me the rock. I'm the guy, whatever. He clearly bought into the idea that he is one of four, and that
Mhm.
as a whole, none of us might win all stars because we're going to cannibalize our numbers a bit, but we will be the best running game. There is in the OUA, which there was probably times where they crested as number one, a couple stretches of weeks. On the whole, you're still dealing with the Westerns and the Lauries and Guelphs of the world, and the Queens, of course. But like, caps off to this young man. Tom, let me give you the floor to talk about Joey Zorn, then let's talk about the combine and going into the draft.
Oh, good gosh. I love the preamble that you kind of led up into there because as an offensive lineman, there's nothing that you love more than an unselfish running back. A dude who is the epitome of a blue collar dude, walking in there with his lunch pail, clocking in, beating some dudes up, making them pay for every time they try to tackle him, and then clocking out and letting one of the other boys go grab the touchdowns. You take the glory. It's all right. I'll carry this whole damn team down to the 1 yard line. You can give somebody else the ball, whether it's a quarterback sneak, whether you give it to one of the other stable of backs. I don't need the touchdown. Let me just get this team W. That's why I'm so high on Joey Zorn. He runs hard, he hits hard, he's not afraid to block. He's an offensive lineman's guy. That's why I've always loved watching him so much.
Just quickly, I'm trying to remember, was it the Laurier game where it was like a third and relatively long and they handed the ball off to him and they didn't pick it up? But, I like I'm sure there's some gif I'm thinking of in my head that I can't name of just the guy standing up amongst a crowd of people sitting down and just clapping of like, yes, that's how you flip and do it. Because there was a game earlier in the year where I think it was maybe against Queens where they were on such a roll marching the ball and then they didn't give it to him on a third and long. We're like, no, you gotta just do what you do and run the ball.
Mhm.
But Tom, Joey Zorn draft, I want to leave that ball in your court.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he did pretty well at the draft. His official numbers: 6 foot 213, puts 225 up 21 times as a running back, which is outstanding. 4.540. I mean, his numbers are pretty impressive especially when you look at some of the other running backs he's going up against here. But from all the talk and the folks that I got a chance to speak to, he didn't necessarily really wow at the individual tryouts. And that's kind of where Joey Zorn has been. It's not that when he touches the ball, your eyes get wide. It's the fact that he's willing to do anything and everything the coach kind of tells him to. It's not very flashy to average 5, 6, 7 yards a carry at times when you're trying to bowl guys over or you're trying to do whatever else. And that's where Joey Zorn has kind of been. So he's not necessarily going to grab people's attention, but as soon as you turn game tape on and you watch this young man, I think that's really where he starts to shine. So with a guy like Zorn, I think showcasing that he's got the speed in the 40-yard dash and showcasing that he's got the strength in that bench press, I think that was some of the best stuff that he could have done, certainly. But I think that the tail of his tape during the season would probably speak better to who he is as a player rather than that.
No, I think that's a great call. I think also like we talked about Oshanubi a little bit when we were doing our CFL Combine breakdown, the running back out of Alberta. Um, and you kind of look across those running backs there, and Oshanubi and Zorn are kind of it's not like leaps and bounds bigger, but if you were a team that's saying, okay, we want to get a running back that's got a bit more size to him, it's probably one of those two guys that you have. And, make my joke about, nationalizing or not nationalizing guys. At the end of the day, this is a guy in Joey Zorn who, if I understand the CFL mechanism correctly, should be considered a national player based on the number of years he's played for Windsor now. And, again, kid from Flint, Michigan. Talk about
Mhm.
that. Hard hat on and bring his lunch pail to the table. Obviously, we're going to talk more about the offense. I think we mentioned this already. The other participants at the combine are the likes of Devin Varasek, Kaladia Musin, Liam Hoskins, again, all from that defense. A defense, as we mentioned, on the D line, especially already lost. Moved to Ageli a year prior, now likely losing Kaladi. Hoskins, don't know. Again, he technically, I think, could come back for a year. Kaladi, I don't know. Versuk in that linebacking core has been so solid with John Rashatzi and Maseo Christmas and those guys, such a stalwart in that. What were you hearing, if anything, about some of those defensive guys, or just what stood out to you, sort of tracking the combine?
Yeah, I think Kaladia Musin, obviously in the one-on-ones, was really able to showcase some good stuff. I don't know that he necessarily dominated how some people were expecting, but he has the speed, he's got the athleticism, and I think he's still kind of wowed. Devin Versa didn't participate in a lot of the training or a lot of the bench press and 40s and things of that nature because he did that at his pro day when he was down at the University of Buffalo, and those numbers are pretty damn impressive. You mentioned Oshi when he ran, he was the fastest at the combine on a 4.41. When Devin Versuk ran at the University of Buffalo, he ran a 4.47. So
Damn.
bench pressing 225 27 times. The dude has gotten some real legitimate interest in the from the NFL scouts
Hell
who were
yeah.
there. I mean, he's listed at 6'2", 232 pounds. At the combine, he registered 240. And let me tell you, it's not like he's drinking beers and got a beer gut on him. The dude is in shape. He's ready to go. He has been the leader on that defense at Windsor. A fantastic defense for a couple years yet now, and there's a specific reason for it. I mean, I can't remember which team it was, but you remember he gets a pick six and he gets into the open field and he's running away from running backs and wide receivers who are trying to chase him down. You go, hey, a linebacker's not supposed to move that fast. What are we doing here? I think he's easily one of the best defenders in the CFL draft, and I would not be surprised if he really has an opportunity in the NFL to really go and do something. I mean, we've seen guys who've obviously played in the CFL and then gone down to the NFL previously. I mean, Alex Singleton is a guy that sticks out to me, a former Calgary Stampeder who was in the CFL and is now enjoying some time in the NFL. That might be the case for Devin Veresuk, but I'd be shocked if he didn't have at least some kind of an opportunity at an NFL squad, whether that's a training camp or what.
We had a great conversation with Brett Hedges last year on this podcast, doing the exit meeting with him, talking Windsor, and he's an Essex region guy. And we were able to pose that question to him of like, what makes Windsor Essex region football so strong? And though I don't remember everything he said right now, go back and listen to that interview or just, hit him up. I'm sure like if it has not, if it, unless he's doing anything with his family, he will make time to talk Windsor region football. Shout out to that guy.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to make a point to clip this to post this on socials for us to have our official reach out to another Essex area footballer that had success playing down south, both at the NCAA level and then NFL level. And Luke Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
come talk to us about Essex region football because your guy in Devin Veresuk is also from the area. I believe he's from Windsor. I think Luke Wilson's from LaSalle. Again, all Essex region. Don't know what's in the water over there. Maybe it's a bit of that American water leaking in here. I don't know what it is. They get great footballers out there. So again, Luke Wilson, we want to have the conversation of all things U Sport football and just what we need to do to grow this game. But let's try and bias it towards his home region in Essex County over there. So again, one of the great things that Windsor has done of late, as we looked at it with Coach Cercelli, isn't just what they do with the Americans, but winning their region. Because for so long, as we talk about it, Western would poach some of those great talents out of that area. So we talk about so often winning your territory, winning your backyard. That is a great backyard to have, and they're starting to win it. And they're actually flipping the tide a little bit. You're starting to see more of those, Middlesex County, London, Ontario guys, St. Thomas guys start to
Mm-hmm.
make their way towards the end of the 401. So again, for all those reasons, and that comes back to the culture and it comes back to guys like JP the Don, Cercelli, where you say, again, we can be ringing the alarm, talking about all these guys who might be gone and say that I still feel like they're going to fill those gaps. And that's how we talk about Western year in, year out. And that is the standard. And that's where obviously all these teams are striving to get to and strive to become. Tom, unless there's anything else combine related or going into the draft, we obviously went through the schedule, but should we take a more Windsor specific look at what is in store for these Lancers in 2025?
Yeah, I think it's time to really deep dive into 2025 here. We haven't had a chance to really do this on any of the other exit meeting pods, so it'd be a shame if we didn't, really.
Absolutely. And I think, and you'll have to help me out here, I think we slawed them in ultimately at 4-4 was
Mm-hmm.
sort of where we had it out at. The schedule for Windsor in 2025, they start off on the road. They have the week one bye. I remember noting that again. We'll come back to at the end of the schedule for them. What a bad beat that is in particular. But they start off their first game in week two of the OUA season, August 30th, on the road at Laurier. They return home on September 9th to take on Guelph. They stay at home for September 13th when they host Tom's McMaster Marauders. They hit the road on September 20th to face the UFT Blues. They return home for a game against Waterloo on September 27th. They hit the road to take on Western on October 4th. They host Western on October 4th. They hit the road to take on Ottawa on October 11th. And then they hit the road to take on Queens to end the season on October 18th. Like, again, that's where this season just absolutely stinks for these guys. Week one bye. You go through, you get Laurier on the schedule, you get Guelph on the schedule, you have a nice middle stretch where you have to, and I don't expect anything but this. You have to go 3 for 3, Mac UFT Waterloo. Then you host Western, you go to Ottawa, you're back in Windsor, then you go to Queens. That is a stinker of a schedule, Tom.
Yeah, that's the raw end of the deal, certainly here. I mean, when you look at the idea of it's always it's never a real good time to have a first week bye in this setting, unless you had something like we did last year when you've got a new head coach and Coach Janke. If there's a brand new system, brand new program, then yeah, maybe having an extra week of training camp is really going to be able to help you out, get a little bit more training and practice and whatever else. But to not only have the week one bye, but then to have back to back major travel to end the season. Ooh, that is rough. And like you mentioned here, it's like you got Laurier, you've got Guelph, you've got Western. Seemingly, at least on paper, I think you and I have those as three losses for this squad here.
Yeah.
You've got the other three that you mentioned with McMaster, Toronto, and Waterloo as three must wins. And then you've got to really try to steal at least one of those between Ottawa and Queens, because if you don't, then that just means that you might miss the playoffs. Or if you do limp in because of certain rankings or whatever else, you are absolutely going to have to travel again, and it might be to either a Laurier, Guelph, or Western. So there's a lot of issues that arise in this right off the hop here that obviously are really settled just as long as you win. As the great Al Davis said, just win, baby.
Yeah. And the thing with that Ottawa Queens game, I was just going through some of the records we played around with from that combine pod, is that Queens, Ottawa, and Windsor, Carleton as well. And that's, how juicy it would have been to swap out, say, that Western game for Carleton. Say they host
Mhm.
Carleton, then they go to Ottawa. Because those, but at least those four teams, but specifically just dive in with Ottawa, Queens, and Windsor, they're all in that. One of them will miss the playoffs at 4-4. One of them will sneak in at 4-4. One will be 5-3, and depending on if they played, like if York ends up with that 5-3 record, we think they could be. Maybe you're hosting a playoff spot.
Mhm.
So like those are playoff games, which almost like raises the question. And I don't think that Don would do this because we're talking about his old stomping grounds, not just with the Mustangs, but London, Ontario. Of like, do you do you just start the Essex Ravens against Western and just say, look, guys, we need to beat Ottawa and Queens on the road. Hey, U18 guys, come on up to the big leagues. Because I don't know. We haven't gotten to the Western pod yet, but and Windsor, as much as any other team that's not Laurier, since Laurier has literally been the only team to beat Western of late,
Mhm.
Windsor's been one of the better teams to give them a shot. Windsor, Guelph gave them a nice shot. Shoot, I guess I have to say Mac gave them a really good shot because they literally did. But Windsor's been able to play them tough. I think when we went through the schedule, we got to that Western pod. Maybe it's unfair to the Windsor folks. Again, Brett Hedges, let me know. Again, that just stinks of a game that's going to be like, I think I said 12-10 going into, or 15-12 going into the fourth quarter, and it's going to end like 32-12 or something like that because Western is going to go on a heater, and just from beating them up, rep after rep, drive after drive, the dam's going to break, and the flood's going to whatever. Yeah, that end of the schedule is absolutely brutal. Any other insights you have about the schedule though?
Well, it is something worth noting here that this is certainly the only team who four out of their eight total regular season games are played at 7 o'clock at night,
Mm,
which is certainly something to look at here. I mean, they start off at Laurier at 7 and then host Guelph and McMaster back to back 7 o'clock games, and then finish their September slate with another 7 p.m. game, which I gotta say, especially in Windsor, where that town loves to show out for their squad, playing under the lights there, it's got to be an electric atmosphere. That's a really neat environment. But man, it would have been nice if they would have had something of all the times to have a 7 p.m. game. It might have been nice to have one on either of that Ottawa or Queens matchup to have a little bit more travel time or have a little bit more something. And we mentioned this previously here, but on that October 11th weekend,
it's
that's the
Thanksgiving.
only game. Every other game is played on the Friday. So I don't know what happened there. I think you raised the point. I don't know when it comes down to the weeks if it's the school or if it's the university or the OUA who has the ability to say you play on a Friday or a Saturday. But man, what a raw deal.
Yeah, no, totally. And maybe we always give credit to Coach Cercelli. I love you when you tell that story of just that the 7 o'clock games in Windsor are often to screw up with the travel times of the other team. I love that. Hey, maybe Coach Belfay reached in his bag of tricks and he's like, all right, you know what? He's looking at the schedule too, being like, Windsor in Ottawa week 8. Yeah, that's going to be a big game. What can we do to kind of mess around with them a little bit?
Mhm.
But, again, it's a heck of a schedule. But again, I think you framed it really nice. We look at those three games, Laurier, Guelph, and Western, and say, all right, look, we don't love those for you. I mean, getting Guelph at home, like Windsor has been the Achilles heel for Guelph over the last couple of years. That's why that 45-40 barn burner last year was so important, because it's coming off the back of like Windsor rushing for like, what was it, like 480 yards in
Mhm.
Windsor against them. The year prior, they beat them. The year before that, the breaking out year for Joey Zorn and all that, they sneak out with the winning Guelph. Like they've had this team's number. So like that's a game where I'm looking at it on paper, and people can say my bias or whatnot. I just do think Guelph is the better team at this stage. I don't think that's that controversial. But do I think Windsor could take that one? Again, we'll get there when we get there. But the three games against Laurier, Guelph, and Western, just kind of say like those are tough games. Those three games against Mac, Toronto, Waterloo, and it comes down to the end of the season. Again, just why that week one bye is such a stinker for them. Tom, I think this was a fantastic job looking at the past, the present, and the future of this Windsor Lancer team. Final thoughts on anything from last year, what the guys preparing for the draft are doing, or what we're looking forward to next year before we call it a wrap?
Yeah, I'm really excited to see who comes back from this Windsor squad. Obviously, you've got a bunch of guys in the draft, and there's a lot of question marks and all of that, but I'm really interested to see who's next at Windsor. Who is the next iteration of the Dons guys? Who's ready to play and ready to really continue that mentality of the OUA runs through the end of the 401 here? And that's a question that I'd love to see answered, and I'd really love to really recognize here. Man, could you imagine a Yates Cup in Windsor? Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. I don't know, man. That's it. It didn't seem like such a far-fetched idea a couple years ago, kind of thing. So we'll see if Windsor can get back to those winning ways and get back into those the Yates Cup conversations.
I mean, if there was ever a home field advantage, that would
Yeah, big
certainly
time.
be it. And you talked about under the lights at Windsor. I don't know if it was last year, 2 years ago, when it was, where they started doing the touchdowns, flashing the lights, like
Yeah.
what, the Jays do on the home runs at Rogers Center. So, love what they're doing there. Again, all those things and all the things we're super positive of speak to the state of the program. And that's the great thing, is that culture, which is in large part a product of, well, it's the players, it's the coaches, but that's a program thing. Culture doesn't graduate. And from
Mhm.
everything that Don's done, from everything, even going back to Coach Joe Demore, previous to that, there is a good culture there. And I forget the numbers that I think it was Hedges who told us, like a lot of all Canadians, like academic all Canadians as well. I
Mhm.
love seeing that. Those are guys who are locked in. They understand that they are student athletes. They're doing that job as best as any other. Yeah, total lockstep with you, seeing who steps up. Just quickly, from perusing the numbers on the defensive side, we talk about all these guys that might be going. Seeing a name in Trey Ranson being third in tackles for them at linebacker, freshman, and Sean Adams, the defensive back, amongst the top tacklers as well. Again, names that, didn't necessarily stick out to us last year amongst all the great players. Like we didn't even mention Istvan Asibo-Dotsi, another senior that, could be gone. Demir Tagani on D-line as well. So again, has that window closed, to be determined, but who will be the one to open it back up? Tom, outstanding job by you as always. We are now, of course, this was our first playoff team with a home game from last year. So we're in the creme de la creme, and we're making our trip from one alumni stadium to another in a little town called the Royal City, Guelph, Ontario. That's what we'll be talking about next week. So tune in. We'll be right here at the 55.